Okay, so can you guys tell me what are some tools that historians use to put together history?
A speech?
A speech, okay. So do you know what that would be? Do you know if that would be a primary source or a secondary source?
Secondary. Primary.
Primary.
Primary. Okay, why do you think it's a primary source, Daniel? Oh, you don't know. Okay, what do you think?
I don't know.
Okay, so that's what we're going to learn today. We're going to learn how to classify a source from a primary source or a secondary source. Okay? The importance of this is because historians need to know what is the legit truth and what is based on opinions and facts. Okay? So the books that you guys are holding, what book are you holding?
John F. Kennedy.
Okay, so that book is a book about his life. Right. So this would be classified as a primary source. Now, what is the difference between a primary and secondary source? That's probably what you guys are asking yourselves. So the difference is that a primary source is coming from a direct person. So anybody kind of give me an example of something that comes from a person themselves? What did we say earlier? Speech, right? A speech is considered a primary source. Any famous speeches that you guys know?
I have
Martin Luther King.
Martin Luther King's speech, I Have a Dream. So you guys say that's a primary source because that comes straight from his mouth. And historians wrote that down, every single word, and that's his primary. They consider that a primary source. Okay? So now a secondary source would be something like this book. Now, what is this book about again? We said it's about his life, right? Do you think John F. Kennedy sat there and wrote a book about himself?
No.
No, right? So, what does it say in the author there? Robert Dallek. Okay, so he's a famous historian, and he wrote John F. Kennedy's life down. So, Nisi over here is holding a book about Mr. Humphrey. And that book was not written by Mr. Humphrey, was it?
No.
Exactly. So the person that wrote that book used primary sources to make a secondary source. So now, if I was doing a presentation about John F. Kennedy or famous presidents, would I rather use something that John F. Kennedy said about himself, or a book about him?
About himself.
Yeah.
About himself, right? Because that's directly coming from his life, right? So these books, the secondary sources, you guys are holding some actual history books from Minnesota. So these books are filled with primary sources and secondary sources. So some examples of primary sources would be stuff like pictures, speeches, periodicals, like back in the day, do you guys remember George Washington? They would write papers called the Federalist Papers, and they'd write their own opinion about what they thought the government should do. And so when they would write that, that would be considered a primary source, because they're writing their own opinion, right? But a secondary source is when somebody is writing about something else. That's coming from a second person, right? So these books could be considered secondary sources because they have stuff that other people wrote. Okay? So, who can give me an example of a primary source? What are some of the things we talked about at the beginning? Okay, a speech. All right, so a speech by a famous person, right? That could be said as a primary source, right? But let's just say I'm a reporter, and I decided that I'm going to write an article for a newspaper about that speech. What is that considered? Is that a primary or secondary?
Secondary.
That's a secondary source. Now, why is that a secondary source?
Because that's coming directly from him.
Yeah, it's coming from my point of view, right? So let's just say Abby gave a speech, and it was about how important education is, right? Let's just say that. Or it was about unicorns. Do you like unicorns? Okay. So you gave a speech about unicorns, and I don't like unicorns. So I was like, well, Abby gave a really boring speech about unicorns, and I didn't like it, and it was really long, and So that was a secondary source. It was me writing about something that she talked about. But if she published her speech in a book, that'd be considered a primary source. Okay? So do you guys think you guys know the difference between a primary source and a secondary source?
Yeah.
So what's so important about a primary and a secondary source that historians need to know? So so that they don't base their facts too much on secondary sources, right? They base it more on the real source, the primary source, from where it's coming from, right? You wouldn't like to know your history through a bunch of opinions. So let's say this. George Washington was declared the president, right? But if we did our history based on secondary sources, what if I didn't like George Washington? In my history book, George Washington was not the first president. It was John F. Kennedy. Would you like to know your history like that, or would you like to know it based on what actually happened?
Based on what actually happened.
That's the importance of primary and secondary sources. So next we'll be doing a group activity describing what second and primary sources are. Okay, so I just gave my lesson and I thought it went pretty well. I had a couple of different age ranges, and so it was kind of difficult to know whether they knew what a primary source or a secondary source was. But I think it went pretty well. I talked to my students afterwards, and they said they actually learned something, which is a good deal. If I could have changed something that I did, I realized I made a mistake pretty much halfway through my lesson when I told a little girl that the book that she was talking about was a primary source. And obviously now, if you watch the rest of the lesson, I classified it as a secondary source, and so after the video was finished taping, I clarified it so that they didn't have any confusion between what was primary and secondary source. But I think that one thing that I'm able to do is to communicate with the kids and really interact with them. And if they have questions, I like to answer questions in a way that's more effective by, just breaking down the question and making sure that the answer is clear and it really does answer what they were saying.